One of these marched thousands of American soldiers straight toward an exploding nuclear bomb on purpose to see what would happen to them. Another fed a deadly virus to disabled children, and every single one of them was planned, funded, and signed by the United States government, then buried for decades.
Tonight, we open 8 more files. Real operations, real victims, real.
They were denied, classified, or hidden in plain sight until a hearing, a leak, or a single reporter dragged them into the daylight. So sit back, because the first file put men in a desert and told them to walk toward the mushroom cloud. File 1, the atomic soldiers. Through the 1950s at the Nevada test site, the United States military did something almost impossible to believe. During a series of exercises called Desert Rock, it positioned its own troops just a few miles from live nuclear detonation. The men crouched in shallow trenches as the bomb went off, felt the heat wash over their back, saw the bones of their own hands through closed eyes in the flash, and then, on command, they stood up and marched directly toward the mushroom cloud, advancing on ground zero to practice fighting on a nuclear battle. They were given no real protection, just their uniforms. Over the full span of America's nuclear test, hundreds of thousands of service members who became known as atomic veterans were exposed to radiation this way. Many were ordered to sign secrecy oaths that forbade them from ever discussing what they had seen, even with their own doctors. So when the cancers came, the leukemia, the tumors, the men could not legally explain why. For decades, the government denied any connection. It was not until 1990 that Congress finally passed a law to compensate some of them. And not until 1996 that the secrecy oaths were formally lifted. The government had marched its own soldiers into nuclear fire, then ordered them to stay silent while it killed them slowly. And the next file is about what it did to children. File 2, Willowbrook. On Staten Island, New York, there was a state institution for children with intellectual disabilities called the Willowbrook State School. It was overcrowded, understaffed, and notorious. And starting in 1956, it became the site of one of the most disturbing medical studies in American history. A researcher named Saul Krugman wanted to understand hepatitis, a virus that was spreading through the school. So he decided to study it the most direct way possible. He deliberately infected healthy, newly arrived children with the live hepatitis virus, in some cases by feeding them extract made from the stool of infected patients. The justification was that the disease was so widespread in Willowbrook that the children would likely catch it anyway. The consent was a cruelty of its own because the school was so overcrowded and had a waiting list. Parents, desperate to get their child admitted, were told that there was space available in the research unit if they agreed to let their child take part in the study. Consent obtained by holding a place hostage. The experiments ran for years and were even published in respected journals before the ethics were widely condemned. Helped by a young reporter named Gerald de Rivera, whose 1972 expose showed the world the horror of the place. The next file is about a secret army. File 3, Operation Gladio. After the Second World War, the United States and its allies were terrified that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe. So the KA, working with NATO, did something that stayed hidden for nearly half a century. Across multiple European countries, they built secret armies. These were behind net groups of armed civilians and operatives with hidden caches of weapons and explosives buried across the continent, ready to wage guerrilla warfare if the Soviets ever rolled in Italy. The network had a name, Gladio, after the Roman short sword. The problem is what some of these secret armies appear to have done while waiting for an invasion that never came. In Italy, during the years of bombings and bloodshed known as the Years of Lead, investigators came to suspect that elements tied to the stay behind network were involved in a strategy of tension, violence designed to be blamed on the political left and frighten the public toward the right. The entire secret was finally dragged into the open in 1990 when the Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, confirmed to Parliament that Gladio was real. A NATO-backed secret army hidden inside democratic countries for decades. The next file is a war the public was never meant to see. File 4, Operation Cyclone. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States saw a chance to give its Cold War rival its own bloody, draining war, so it launched one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in its history. The program was called Operation Cyclone, and its purpose was to secretly arm, fund, and train the Afghan fighters resisting the Soviets, the mujahideen. The money was staggering. What began as a modest budget grew into hundreds of millions of dollars a year, much of it funneled through Pakistan's intelligence service. The KA supplied the fighters with weapons, including, eventually, the shoulder, fired Stinger missiles, that could knock Soviet helicopters out of the sky and help turn the tide of the war. The strategy worked. The Soviets were bled white and withdrew in 1989. But the weapons, the training, and the networks of hardened fighters did not simply vanish when the war ended. The fallout from arming a holy war in the mountains of Afghanistan would echo for decades in ways that would eventually come home. The next file leaves the ground entirely. File 5, Operation Crossroads. In the summer of 1946, with the Second World War barely over, the United States gathered a ghost fleet at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. It assembled more than 90 warships, including captured enemy vessels and its own retired ship, and anchored them together in a lagoon. Then it set off nuclear bomb on top of them. The purpose was to study what atomic weapons would do to a navy. There were 2 detonations. The first, an airburst, was almost a disappointment. The second, called Bake, was detonated underwater and produced one of the most famous and terrifying images of the nuclear age. A colossal column of radioactive seawater, nearly a mile wide, rising into the sky with the silhouettes of battleships tossed around its base. But here's the part that is often forgotten. The ships were not empty. The military had placed live animals on board: pigs, rats, and goats, strapped into position to measure how the blast and the radiation would affect living bodies. And around 42,000 American servicemen took part in the operation. Many of them later sent aboard the contaminated ships to scrub them down, soaking up radiation in the process. The next file is the strangest thing the government ever put into the sky. File 6. Project West Ford. In the early 1960s, American military planners had a night. What if, in a war, the Soviets cut the undersea cables that carried the world's communication? America's ability to talk to its forces could go dark, so they came up with a solution that sounds like science fiction. They would give the entire planet a permanent artificial ring. The plan, called Project West Ford, was to launch nearly 500 million tiny copper needles into orbit around the Earth. Each needle was thin as a hair and just under an inch long, and together, around 480 million of them would form a vast ring of metal circling the globe, a man-made belt that radio signals could bounce off of to reach anywhere on Earth. In 1963, they did it. They scattered the needles into orbit. Astronomers around the world were furious, warning that the military was littering space and could ruin the view of the heavens. The system worked briefly, but satellites soon made it obsolete, and yet the legacy remained. To this day, clumps of those copper needles are still up there, slowly circling the planet.
Decades after anyone needed them, the next file is a secret hidden in plain sight under a luxury hotel.
File 7, Project Greek Island. In the mountains of West Virginia sits the Greenbrier, a grand and famous luxury resort where presidents and high society have vacationed for generations. But for more than 30 years, the Greenbrier was hiding an enormous secret directly beneath its guests. Starting around 1958, under the codename Project Greek Island, the government secretly built a massive fortified bunker into the hillside beneath the hotel. It was designed for one purpose: to house the entire United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. The bunker had dormitories with hundreds of beds, a power plant, a clinic, a broadcast studio, so leaders could address the nation, and even a full chamber for the House and the Senate to meet. Blast doors weighing many tons sealed it off, and all of it sat behind an ordinary-looking conference wing of the hotel, where real guests held real meetings with no idea that a doomsday command center waited on the other side of the wall. The whole thing was kept running, fully stocked and staffed undercover for over 3 decades, until a Washington Post reporter exposed it in 1992. The last file tonight is a weapon out of a movie that the government spent real money trying to build. File 8, Project Excalibur. In the 1980s, as President Reagan pushed his Strategic Defense Initiative, the program the press nicknamed Star Wars, scientists at the Lawrence Livermore Weapons Lab were chasing an idea of pure science fiction. They wanted to build a space weapon powered by a nuclear bomb. The concept, called Project Excalibur, was almost unbelievable. You would put a nuclear warhead in space, surrounded by dozens of metal rods. At the instant the bomb detonated, in the fraction of a second before the device destroyed itself, the explosion would pump those rods into powerful beams of X-rays, each one aimed at a different incoming Soviet missile. A single nuclear bomb, in other words, that would die in a flash while firing dozens of laser-like beams to shoot down an entire nuclear attack. The lab, driven by the famous physicist Edward Teller, told Washington the early tests were a triumph, but the results had been wildly oversold. The X Ray laser never came close to working as promised. The physics fought back, and after consuming a fortune in funding, the dream of a nuclear-powered death ray in orbit quietly collapsed. The government had spent years and a fortune trying to build a doomsday weapon straight out of a comic book. 8 more files, soldiers marched into a nuclear blast and sworn to silence. Children fed a virus for science. A secret army hidden inside democracies, a covert war whose weapons came home, a fleet nuked with animals aboard, 500 million needles flung into space, a doomsday bunker under a luxury hotel, and a nuclear-powered laser pulled from a comic book. Every one of them real. Everyone approved, funded, and signed, then buried until someone refused to keep it quiet. And here's the thought to leave you with tonight. These are only the programs that were eventually admitted. The ones forced into the light by a hearing or a leak or a single stubborn reporter. If marching men into atomic fire and feeding children a virus are the secrets they were willing to confess. Sit for a moment with what might still be locked in the files they will never open. Tell me in the comments which one disturbed you the most and which file you want me to open next. Subscribe to the Unknown Files, and I will see you when the next one is declassified.